Welcome back. Tonight, we're descending into the abandoned halls of Playtime Company, where childhood joy became an industrial nightmare of human experimentation, mass murder, and corporate horror that stretches far beyond the colorful mascots and jump scares. From orphan children surgically transformed into living toys, to a massacre that consumed hundreds in a single hour, to secrets that suggest something even darker lurking beneath. And this is about the true horror hiding behind those smiling faces. In 1930, a man named Elliot Ludwig stood at a crossroads that would ultimately doom hundreds of innocent lives. The divorce papers from his wife Molly sat on his desk, the ink barely dry, a casualty of his obsessive dedication to work over family. But Ludwig wasn't deterred. If anything, the loss only intensified his vision to create the greatest toy company the world had ever seen, one that would bring joy to children everywhere. What began as an ambitious dream would evolve into something far more sinister, as personal tragedy twisted noble intentions into unthinkable experiments. Ludwig poured everything into Playtime Company, building it from nothing into the most famous toy manufacturing company of its time. For decades, his creations delighted children across the globe. Colorful animals, imaginative playsets, and innovations that pushed the boundaries of what toys could be. But Ludwig remained haunted by something missing in his life, that emptiness where family should have been. He couldn't separate work from personal life, and his company became his entire existence. Then came 1949, and everything changed. On March 7th of that year, a girl named Poppy was born. Whether she was Ludwig's biological daughter with another woman or an adopted child remains ambiguous in the records, and though the evidence leans heavily toward adoption. What matters is that Ludwig finally had the family he'd always craved. Poppy became the center of his world, the daughter who would understand his vision, who could share in his dreams of bringing happiness to children everywhere. But fate had cruel plans. Sometime in the 1960s, an unfortunate family death pushed Ludwig to his absolute lowest point. While exact details remain scarce, all evidence points to young Poppy falling seriously ill or dying at a relatively young age. A recently discovered tape from Chapter 4 features Poppy herself discussing the aftermath of later events, revealing that she is indeed Elliot Ludwig's daughter and explaining that things were better when he was in charge. This confirmation, combined with the discovery of a child's eviscerated body in Ludwig's home, paints a devastating picture of a father who couldn't accept his daughter's death. And this tragedy became the catalyst for everything that followed. Ludwig's grief transformed into obsession, his desire to save his daughter evolving into something far darker. He began researching the poppy flower, drawn to its unusual properties and heavy symbolism throughout history. Poppies have long represented sleep, peace, and death, used as sedatives and associated with eternal rest in mythology. But Ludwig believed there was something more, something that could cheat death itself. His experiments started small. Experiment 814 involved a dead rat, where poppy gel was used in an attempt at resurrection. The results must have been promising enough to continue, because Ludwig became convinced that the proper mixture and procedure could have life-altering properties. He wrote extensively about his belief that the poppy flower's symbolism wasn't coincidental, that perhaps something larger than human understanding was at work. But animal experiments weren't enough. To perfect the process, to create something that could truly bring his daughter back, Ludwig needed a human test subject. This is where the story takes its most disturbing turn. because Ludwig didn't experiment on adults or volunteers. He turned his attention to orphan children, those without families to miss them, without parents to ask questions. The boy Ludwig chose was named Oliver, though he would later be called Ollie. According to recent revelations in Chapter 5, Oliver was an orphan who had been adopted by Ludwig himself. The man saw the perfect qualities in this child. Oliver was kind, smart, trusting. He would make an ideal test subject, a prototype to pave the way for Poppy's resurrection. Ludwig's reasoning was cold and calculated. If the experiment succeeded with Oliver, he could perfect the technique and bring back his precious daughter. If it failed, well, there were always more orphans, while the transformation of Oliver into Experiment 1006, known simply as the prototype, marked the true beginning of Playtime Company's descent into horror. The process involved surgically transferring human consciousness into bioengineered toy bodies using poppy gel as a binding agent. This wasn't a painless digital upload or a peaceful transition. The records suggest it was an agonizing procedure that left subjects fully aware of what was being done to them, their minds trapped in bodies that were no longer human. The prototype proved that the impossible was possible. A human being could be placed inside a toy body and survive. Ludwig had achieved his goal, though at a terrible cost to young Oliver. But rather than feeling satisfaction, the prototype felt only resentment. He understood immediately what he was: a rough draft, a stepping stone, expendable. He existed only to prove the technique worked so that Poppy could be created properly. This knowledge, this understanding that he was never meant to be saved for his own sake, planted seeds of hatred that would grow for decades. With the prototype's creation validated, Ludwig moved forward with his ultimate goal. Young Poppy, whether already deceased or dying, underwent the same transformation. But her procedure was refined, perfected. Everything Ludwig had learned from Oliver's suffering applied to make her the ideal experiment. Unlike the prototype and the horrors that would follow, Poppy was created with different methods that made her truly immortal, requiring no food to survive, unlike the biological monstrosities that came later. Here's what makes this foundation so deeply disturbing. Elliot Ludwig is often portrayed as the sympathetic figure in this story, the grieving father who meant well before things got out of hand. But recent discoveries paint a much darker picture. A hidden document labeled LP, a journal entry found in Chapter 5's archives, reveals something shocking. Leith Pierre, the executive who took over after Ludwig's death, wrote that Playtime Company executives had absolutely no idea that Poppy, or the prototype, even existed during Ludwig's lifetime. Think about what that means. Ludwig conducted these experiments in complete secrecy, building hidden facilities, performing surgery on children, creating living toys, all without the knowledge of his own company's leadership. This wasn't a well-intentioned program that gradually became corrupted. This was human experimentation, hidden in the shadows from the very beginning, carried out by the company's founder himself. Ludwig was the original monster, the first to cross that line from which there could be no return. The irony is crushing. A man who wanted to bring joy to children, who divorced because he couldn't balance work and family, who founded an empire on the promise of happiness and ended up becoming the architect of unimaginable suffering for countless orphan children. His grief, however genuine, led him to justify the torture and transformation of innocent lives. Oliver's betrayal at being used as a test subject, Poppy's existence as a resurrected corpse in a toy body, these were just the beginning. Ludwig's death, sometime between 1984 and 1990, didn't end the horror. It only changed management. The programs he'd established in secret, and the techniques he'd perfected, the precedent he'd set that children could be used as experimental subjects, all of this continued and expanded under new leadership. His legacy wasn't the toys that brought joy to millions. His legacy was a factory built on child experimentation, a company that saw orphans as raw materials, and a culture where human life became negotiable in the pursuit of scientific advancement and corporate profit. Playcare, the underground prison disguised as hope. In 1976, Playtime Company opened a new facility beneath the factory, a massive underground complex that would be marketed as the company's greatest humanitarian achievement. Playcare, as it was called, was advertised as an on-site orphanage, a place where homeless children from around the world could find safety, education, and love. Posters showed smiling children playing with friendly mascots, and brochures promised a complete town-like environment where orphans would never want for anything. The reality was so much darker than anyone could have imagined. The location itself should have raised immediate red flags. Playcare wasn't built in a separate building with oversight and public access. It was constructed deep underground, hidden beneath the factory, where no outside eyes could see what happened. Built by Warren Buck Construction, and the same company that would later build the game station testing facility, Playcare was designed from the start to be isolated and controlled. Upon entering Playcare, you'd descend a long stairway adorned with red carpet, little trees with colorful flowers, decorative street lamps, all designed to create an illusion of normalcy and cheer. But those rope poles with broken toys hanging from them, the bloodstains that would later mar every surface, the cardboard cutouts of mascots watching with permanently fixed smiles, all of this created an atmosphere of wrongness that the cheerful decorations couldn't quite mask. The facility itself was enormous, built like its own small town. There were dormitories where the children slept, a massive playground for recreation, even a school called the School of Playcare, where teachers called Miss Delights educated the orphans. On the surface, it seemed like a dream environment for children who'd lost everything. But every aspect of Playcare had a secondary, sinister purpose. The mascots of Playcare were the smiling critters, a line of colorful animal characters with giant perpetual grins. There was Dog Day, the cheerful leader, Picky Piggy, who supposedly taught about nutrition, and Catnap, the purple cat who helped children sleep. These characters were everywhere, statues and information panels, cartoons and toys. All designed to make the children feel safe and happy. But these mascots weren't just for entertainment. They were psychological conditioning tools, preparing children to trust the very beings they would eventually become. The true purpose of Playcare became clear when you understand the companion program, the Foster and Adoptive Care Initiative. This program encouraged Playtime Company employees to foster or adopt orphans from Playcare, with promises of additional benefits for participation. And on paper, this sounds wonderful, a way to place children in loving homes. But in practice, it served a much darker function. When a child disappeared from Playcare, taken for experimentation and transformation, counselors who weren't aware of the Bigger Bodies initiative could simply be told the child had been adopted. The paperwork would check out, the foster program provided cover, and no one would ask questions about where little Timmy or Sarah had really gone. But the most disturbing aspect of Playcare was how the children were controlled and manipulated from the moment they arrived. At night, a substance called red smoke would be released throughout the dormitories. Officially, this was presented as a sleep aid, a way to help traumatized orphans rest better after the horrors they'd experienced in their young lives. The reality was far more sinister. Red smoke was a hallucinogenic gas with sedative properties, originally developed to make it easier for counselors to manage large groups of children. If the orphans were knocked unconscious every night, they required less supervision, fewer resources. But the gas had severe side effects. Children experienced horrifying nightmares while under its influence, visions of monsters and darkness that would haunt them even when awake. One orphan named Marie Payne, who would later become the experiment known as Mommy Long Legs, undocumented her terror of these nightmares in requests for transfer. More importantly, the red smoke served a practical purpose for the scientists. With the children unconscious every night, medical staff could enter the dormitories and remove orphans for checkups or preliminary experimentation without anyone noticing. A child could be taken from their bed, subjected to tests or procedures in hidden labs, and returned before morning with no memory of what happened. The smoke ensured compliance and erased potential witnesses, and kept the orphans in a state of controlled confusion where they couldn't quite trust their own perceptions. The education at Playcare's school was perhaps the most insidious form of manipulation. The curriculum wasn't focused on preparing children for normal life or helping them cope with trauma. Instead, the Smiling Critters and Mr. Lights taught a very specific philosophy, that self-sacrifice for the advancement of science and humanity was the highest calling a person could aspire to. Children were taught that giving up their bodies and lives for innovation was noble, heroic, something to be proud of. Imagine being an orphan at Playcare, maybe 8 or 9 years old. You've already lost your parents, lost everything familiar. You're told this company cares about you, that you're special. In every day, you're taught that the most meaningful thing you can do is help science advance, that your suffering might cure diseases or make life better for everyone else. The indoctrination was so thorough that some children might have gone to their transformations believing they were heroes rather than victims. The game station, built specifically to test the orphans, took this manipulation to its logical conclusion. Children would be assigned to specific toy characters, then forced to complete 3 minigames that tested their brain speed, reaction time, and physical endurance. Scientists watched from observation rooms, recording every detail of each child's performance. The assessments were sent to Stella Graber, Playcare's head administrator, who would determine which children scored high enough to become subjects for the Bigger Bodies initiative. This testing process is particularly cruel when you understand what it meant, and the orphans thought they were playing games, maybe competing for prizes or recognition. They didn't know they were auditioning for their own destruction. That good performance meant being selected for transformation into monsters. The children who tried their hardest, who wanted to impress the adults and prove their worth, were the ones who sealed their own fates. Throughout Playcare's operation, there were hints that some staff members felt uncomfortable with what was happening, and whispers about children disappearing, questions about why certain kids were never seen again after their game station visits. But the combination of the Foster Initiative cover story, the isolated underground location, and the need to keep their jobs ensured, most stayed silent. Those who dug too deep or asked too many questions found themselves either forcibly transformed into experiments themselves or simply disappeared. Another unfortunate accident in a factory with many safety hazards. The orphans themselves developed a culture of fear within Playcare's walls. They created rumors and legends about the toys, warnings to each other about which mascots to avoid, which counselors seemed too interested in certain children. An orphan named Riley, who entered Playcare in August 1994 at age 12, kept a journal documenting her feelings of being an outsider because most children had arrived much younger. Reading between the lines of her entries, and you can sense the dread, the knowledge that something was very wrong, even if she couldn't articulate exactly what. By the early 1990s, Playcare had become a well-oiled machine for processing vulnerable children into experimental subjects. Hundreds of orphans had passed through its doors, and a disturbing percentage never left, not as humans anyway. The smiling critters watched everything, their perpetual grins now seeming more like threats than comfort. Catnap's statue in particular had an unsettling quality, its eyes seeming to follow children through the halls, a preview of the monster that Theodore Gramble would become. The genius of Playcare's horror lies in how it weaponized hope. These children arrived broken, desperate for someone to care about them. They were given food, shelter, education, told they were special and important. The psychological devastation when they realized the truth, and that they were never valued as people but only as experimental material, must have been shattering. Some experiments retained enough humanity to remember their time as children in Playcare, which meant they lived with the knowledge that the place they'd been told was home was actually a hunting ground, and they'd been prey all along. The Bigger Bodies Initiative. Industrial scale, human experimentation. On March 30th, 1991, our Playtime company formally initiated a program that would lead directly to its downfall and the deaths of hundreds of people. The Bigger Bodies Initiative, proposed by a scientist named Dr. Harley Sawyer, promised to solve all of the company's mounting problems through a single revolutionary solution: transform orphan children into giant working toys that could replace the entire human workforce. Harley Sawyer was a complicated figure in Playtime's history. He'd been part of Ludwig's Young Geniuses program, an initiative that identified child prodigies for future work at the company. Documents from Chapter 4's Icepick ARG reveal that Sawyer was exceptionally brilliant even as a young person, but he was also arrogant and obsessed with recognition. When Ludwig eventually removed him from the program, the rejection letter explained it was because Ludwig genuinely believed that hardship would help Sawyer grow into a kinder, more open person who cared about humanity rather than personal glory. Ludwig's hope was tragically misplaced. Sawyer took the opposite lesson from his rejection. He became consumed with proving himself, with achieving scientific breakthroughs that would force recognition regardless of moral cost. When Playtime Company began facing serious problems in the late 1980s and early 1990s, Sawyer saw his opportunity. The company's troubles were mounting on every front, and profits were declining as competitors entered the market. Failed experiments were piling up, with incomplete or flawed subjects that required disposal. Lower-level employees were accidentally witnessing confidential projects, creating liability issues. There were lawsuits from workplace accidents, massive repair costs from aging facilities, and the ever-growing burden of employee payroll. The recall of all Catnap toys, due to unspecified issues, had particularly hurt the company's reputation and finances. Sawyer's proposal was elegantly simple from a business perspective. Create giant biological toys modeled after the company's mascots, use them to replace human workers entirely, eliminate payroll and lawsuit exposure while gaining tireless employees who would never need breaks or complain about working conditions. To Playtime's executives, desperate to save the company from collapse, this must have seemed like a miraculous solution. The reality of implementing the Bigger Bodies initiative was far more horrific than any mission statement suggested. The process required hundreds of human test subjects, and Sawyer already knew where to find them. Playcare's orphanage, conveniently located right beneath the factory, full of children with no families to search for them. The transformation process was detailed in various documents and logs found throughout the facility, and each piece of information makes the horror more visceral. After an orphan was selected through game station testing, they would be sent back to Playcare temporarily, kept comfortable while final preparations were made. When the time came, they would be taken to surgical theaters deep within the factory complex. The surgical procedure itself involved techniques that blur the line between medicine and body horror. Scientists would use poppy gel, the same substance Ludwig had discovered in his experiments with resurrection, combined with cutting-edge surgical methods to transfer the child's consciousness and essential biological functions into a much larger bioengineered body, shaped like one of Playtime's mascots. This wasn't uploading a mind to a computer or cloning, and this was physically taking a human being apart and rebuilding them as something else. The poppy gel served as a binding agent that could integrate human tissue with synthetic materials and maintain life functions in bodies that shouldn't biologically work. Records indicate it could carry electrical signals like nerves, process nutrients, even preserve memories and personality to some degree. But the gel also had disturbing properties. It could keep subjects alive far beyond what should be possible, forcing consciousness to persist even in damaged or incomplete bodies. Psychological conditioning accompanied the physical transformation. Documents mention a device created during Sawyer's tenure that could extract and implant memories. This technology allowed scientists to selectively remove traumatic memories, alter personalities, or even create multiple experiments from a single subject by copying their mind into different bodies. The implications are staggering. How many of Playcare's orphans had their memories harvested and duplicated before their original bodies were destroyed? One experiment stands as a particularly disturbing example of this technology. Experiment 1322, known as Doey the Doman, was created from 3 test subjects instead of 1. Jack Ayers, Kevin Barnes, and Matthew Hallard. Their consciousnesses were somehow merged into a single entity, 3 minds sharing one body, unable to fully separate or communicate their individual identities. The project notes describe this as an attempt to create an experiment capable of performing multiple tasks simultaneously. The variety of experiments created through the Bigger Bodies initiative reveals the thoroughness of Sawyer's plan to replace all human workers. Experiment 1170, Huggy Wuggy, was designed for security, his blue fur and enormous size making him perfect for deterring intruders, while his intelligence allowed him to patrol autonomously. Experiment 1222, Mommy Long Legs, with her extendable elastic plastic limbs, could oversee the entire game station from vantage points no human could reach, while simultaneously interacting with children across vast distances. Experiment 1188, Catnap, became the guardian of Playcare itself, his ability to produce red smoke making him ideal for keeping orphans sedated and compliant. Experiment 1160, Boxy Boo, served as the company's disposal method, his body containing trash compactor-like qualities that could devour any employee who posed a liability. Each creation had a specific role in Playtime's operation. turning the factory into a self-sustaining system of living toys maintaining their own prison. The biological reality of these experiments makes their existence even more nightmarish. Despite their toy-like appearance, the bigger bodies were organic creatures with genuine biological needs. They required food to survive, could feel pain, experienced hunger and cold, and all the physical sensations of living beings. Their bodies were grotesquely disproportionate, with thin, emaciated torsos supporting massive limbs, exposed rib cages and skeletal structures visible beneath stretched skin and fur. They were living things trapped in forms that shouldn't exist, perpetually uncomfortable in bodies that defied natural law. Sawyer's attitude toward his creations reveals the depths of his moral bankruptcy. Audio logs feature him discussing experiments with clinical detachment, noting their behaviors and responses, as if documenting insects rather than transformed children. In when the prototype proved dangerously intelligent and began sabotaging the initiative, Sawyer expressed fascination rather than horror, calling the entity wonderful and admitting he found it captivating despite the threat it posed. The scale of the Bigger Bodies initiative is difficult to comprehend. Based on experiment numbers mentioned throughout the game, there were at minimum 1,468 documented transformations, and though many experiments between certain numbers remain unaccounted for in player-accessible records, this means well over 1,000 orphans, possibly many more, underwent this procedure during the initiative's operation from 1990 through 1995. Not every transformation was successful. Documents hint at numerous failures, experiments that didn't survive the procedure or emerge so damaged they had to be disposed of. These failures weren't treated as tragedies, but as learning opportunities, data points that brought scientists closer to perfecting the technique. The bodies of failed experiments were likely processed through Boxy Boo, or hidden in sealed sections of the facility, erased from records as thoroughly as the children's original identities. Some employees volunteered to become experiments, though volunteered must be examined carefully in context. Take Thomas Clark, a pediatrician who worked at Playcare. When diagnosed with lung cancer in 1991, he agreed to become experiment 1173, known as Bron. Was this genuine volunteering, or a desperate man given a horrifying choice between death and transformation? The documents frame it as heroic self-sacrifice, but the reality might be coercion disguised as consent. The initiative also created a Bigger Bodies handbook and relocation guide for employee training, a detail that reveals how normalized this horror had become. There were official procedures for moving experiments, protocols for containing them if they became violent, guidelines for employees who might encounter these creatures in the facility. The handbook presumably explained what to do if lower-level workers discovered the truth, though such employees tended to disappear or become experiments themselves shortly after learning too much. By 1995, a Playtime company had essentially become two organizations. The public-facing toy manufacturer, still producing regular products and maintaining the innocent facade, and the hidden nightmare beneath, where an underground factory processed orphaned children into biological machinery, where scientists debated which memories to erase and which organs could be replaced with synthetic materials, where the line between human and toy had been obliterated entirely, the true horror of transformation. The clinical documents and numbered experiments mask the individual suffering each transformation represented. To truly understand the horror of the Bigger Bodies initiative, you have to imagine it from the perspective of a single child. one of the more than 1,000 orphans who entered the program and emerged as something no longer human. Let's consider Marie Payne, who became Experiment 1222. Better known as Mommy Longlegs, our records paint a devastating picture of a kind woman who loved children, who volunteered to work at the game station because she wanted to help orphans find joy and purpose. She was motherly, caring, creating a safe environment where frightened kids could play games and feel valued. Her transfer request, filed before her transformation, mentions nightmares caused by the red smoke, a quiet plea for escape that went unanswered. Marie didn't volunteer to become an experiment. She was selected, possibly because her motherly nature made her ideal for overseeing children at the game station, or perhaps because she'd seen too much and knew too many details that made her a liability. Whatever the reason, Marie Payne was taken to the surgical theatres and transformed into a pink spider-like creature with impossibly long, elastic limbs. The transformation process itself would have been agony beyond description. Imagine being conscious or semi-conscious as your body is systematically dismantled, your bones lengthened and hollowed, your muscles stretched and rewoven with synthetic fibers, your internal organs repositioned or replaced with mechanical alternatives, the poppy gel burning through your bloodstream as it rewrites your biology at a cellular level, binding human tissue to artificial components, keeping you alive through procedures that should kill you instantly. Your face reshaped, jaw restructured, a skin stretched over a skull that's no longer quite human. The addition of extra limbs, long segmented appendages erupting from your torso, each one sending new sensory information to a brain not designed to process such input. The psychological horror of looking down at your new body for the first time, seeing pink fur where skin should be, a spider's body where a woman's form once existed. But physical transformation was only part of the nightmare, and the psychological conditioning that accompanied the procedure aimed to erase identity and replace it with programmed function. Scientists used their memory manipulation device to selectively alter Marie's consciousness, trying to remove her sense of self while preserving her motherly instincts toward children. This is why Mommy Longlegs retained her caring nature initially, but became increasingly unstable and violent over time. The conditioning was imperfect, and allowing fragments of Marie Payne to persist beneath the experiment's programming. The game's portrayal of Mommy Longlegs shows a creature that's deeply damaged psychologically. She's obsessed with games and rules, flying into murderous rage when players cheat or fail to follow her instructions. This isn't random monster behavior. It's trauma expressing itself through the only framework the experiment understands. Marie Payne was turned into a game-obsessed monster to oversee the game station, her personality forcibly reshaped to suit her function. The anger and violence come from a consciousness that knows something is wrong, but can't quite articulate what it lost. Consider the sensory nightmare of existing as a bigger body. Your perception is fundamentally altered. Distance is warping because your new body is 3 or 4 times taller than your human form was. Proprioception, your sense of where your body parts are in space, is completely disrupted by limbs that extend 20 feet when they should be 2. Every movement requires conscious thought and adjustment, your brain struggling to send signals through neural pathways that don't match your biological programming. Hunger becomes a constant torture. The bigger bodies require massive amounts of food to sustain their enlarged forms, but they can't eat normal meals. Their digestive systems are hybrid horrors of human organs and synthetic processing chambers, incapable of breaking down materials that should be inedible, but never quite satisfying the persistent gnawing sensation. Some experiments were reported to have eaten corpses during the hour of joy, not from malice, but desperate starvation after being denied adequate food for years. The lack of proper rest must have been maddening. Do these creatures sleep like humans? Or do their partially mechanical systems only require dormant states? Our records suggest they experience fatigue, but couldn't achieve genuine sleep, leaving them in a constant state of exhausted awareness. Catnap's association with sleep and his production of red smoke might have been the only mercy some experiments received. Brief periods of chemical unconsciousness that approximated real rest. The psychological isolation compounds everything else. Each bigger body is utterly alone in its experience. There's no one who understands what it's like to be you, to have lost your humanity in this specific way. You might retain memories of your human life, fragmented images of parents who died or abandoned you, the orphanage where you thought you'd find safety, friends who vanished one by one as they were selected for transformation. But you can't share these memories because your vocal cords have been restructured, your voice now emerging as something inhuman. Some experiments retained more humanity than others, creating a hierarchy of suffering. Poppy and the prototype, created with different methods during Ludwig's secret experiments, were fully sentient and intelligent, essentially human minds in toy bodies. They could think, plan, remember everything they'd been. The bigger bodies' initiative subjects were less fortunate. Their consciousnesses degraded or fragmented by the imperfect transformation process. They experienced emotions and retained some memories, but their thinking was clouded, and animalistic instincts mixing with human awareness in ways that must have been terrifying. The implications of memory manipulation add another layer of horror. If scientists could copy consciousness and implant it in multiple bodies, did they? Are there experiments walking the factory who share memories with other creatures, not sure which version of themselves is original? Did children wake up in multiple bodies simultaneously? Consciousness split between different experiments. I'm experiencing reality from several perspectives at once until their minds shattered from the impossibility. Consider experiment 1066 Yarnaby, whose documents describe him as docile and highly impressionable. Quinn Navidson, the orphan who became Yarnaby, was deliberately isolated and manipulated by Sawyer to become his personal bodyguard. The psychological abuse involved in grooming a child to become a loyal servant, erasing their will and replacing it with slavish devotion, reveals that the transformations weren't just physical. Sawyer was reshaping minds as thoroughly as bodies, turning children into tools that served his purposes without question. The few experiments who retained enough humanity to communicate their suffering provide glimpses into this hell. Dog Day, the last surviving smiling critter besides Catnap, was found in Chapter 3, imprisoned in a cell. His legs removed, his body hollow and filled with parasitic ruined critters. When he spoke to the player, his words carried the weight of someone who'd endured years of torture. He explained that Catnap worshipped the prototype and killed anyone who defied him, that Playcare was a territory controlled by a zealot who'd mutilated his former friends for the crime of resistance. Dog Day called the player an angel, a desperate grasp at a hope from someone who'd lost everything. His plea to be freed cut short as the parasites inside him seized control and forced him to attack. Hyde encapsulates the tragedy of all bigger bodies. They're aware enough to suffer, aware enough to know what they've lost, but trapped in bodies and situations from which there is no escape. Even mercy killing is difficult because the poppy gel keeps them alive. their consciousness persisting in ruined flesh that should have died long ago. The Mr. Lights provide another perspective on transformation horror. These experiments were specifically created as teachers for Playcare school, and a whole series of identical sisters designed to educate orphans. When the hour of joy occurred and normal food supplies vanished, the Mr. Lights faced starvation. In desperation, they turned on each other, the surviving teachers cannibalizing their sisters to stay alive. By the time the player encounters the last Mr. Light in Chapter 3, she's alone, consumed by guilt and hunger, her sanity eroded by years of isolation and the memory of eating her own family. This is the true horror of the Bigger Bodies initiative. Not death, but transformation into living torture that never ends. These experiments can't die easily, can't escape their bodies, can't return to what they were. They exist in a state of perpetual suffering, aware enough to know they've lost their humanity, but not human enough to process that loss properly. Their creators saw them as solutions to business problems, but they're actually thousands of individual tragedies, and each one a child who was promised safety and received nightmare. Catnap and the birth of a death cult. Among all the experiments created by Playtime Company, none embodies the psychological devastation of the Bigger Bodies initiative quite like experiment 1188. Theo Grambel, transformed into the purple cat monster known as Catnap. His story reveals how trauma, religious indoctrination, and corporate manipulation can create a zealot willing to murder hundreds in the name of false salvation. Theodore Grambel arrived at Playcare as an orphan child, one of countless kids who'd lost everything and desperately needed safety and love. The records don't specify exactly when Theo came to the orphanage, but it was some time before he'd grown old enough to understand the full horror of his situation. Like all Playcare orphans, he was exposed to the Smiling Critters cartoon programming, learning about Catnap, the friendly purple cat who helped children sleep peacefully. Theo's transformation didn't begin with surgery. It started with an incident that would define his entire existence and ultimately doom hundreds of people. At some point during his time at Playcare, young Theodore attempted to escape the orphanage. The exact circumstances aren't detailed, but something drove him to flee, to try reaching the surface and freedom. Perhaps he'd learned too much about the game station. Perhaps he'd seen other children disappear and understood the danger. Whatever his reason, Theo ran. He almost made it. But during his escape attempt, Theodore was electrocuted, presumably by one of the security systems designed to prevent exactly this kind of flight. The voltage should have killed him instantly, a tragic but quick end to a desperate child's failed attempt at freedom. But the prototype intervened. This moment and this critical intervention became the foundation for everything that followed. The prototype saved Theodore's life, either through direct action or by convincing scientists to use the Bigger Bodies process to preserve him. To young Theo, traumatized and dying, the prototype wasn't an experiment or victim. He was a savior, a god who'd snatched him back from death itself. This gratitude, this perception of being saved, created an unbreakable psychological bond that would persist even after Theodore ceased to be human. The transformation of Theodore into Catnap followed the standard Bigger Bodies procedure, but with specific modifications that made him uniquely valuable to Playtime Company. His role would be guardian of Playcare, the figure who kept orphans docile and prevented further escape attempts. To fulfill this function, scientists built red smoke production capabilities directly into his body, and installing gas canisters and emission systems beneath his purple fur. The resulting creature was anatomically horrifying. Catnap's bigger body form stood approximately 8 feet tall, cloaked in purple fur that couldn't quite hide the emaciated torso beneath. His ribs were visible through stretched skin, his spine and pelvic bone exposed, suggesting the transformation process had left insufficient tissue to properly cover his enlarged skeletal structure. His mouth hung permanently open, a void-like abyss without visible teeth, and his limbs were unnaturally elongated and thin, seemingly held together by crude stitching at the joints. Most disturbing were his eyes, black pupils encircled by white irises, forever fixed in an expression of blank attention. Those eyes would watch children sleep, patrol Playcare's corridors, witness the selection process for game station testing. Theodore's human gaze preserved in a face that was no longer human, unconsciousness trapped behind a monster's features. But Catnap's true horror wasn't his appearance. It was what the transformation did to Theodore's mind, and his interpretation of what had happened to him. Remember, he believed the prototype had saved him. Now, trapped in this new body, unable to ever return to human form, Theodore needed to make sense of his situation. The cognitive dissonance between being saved and being turned into a monster was unbearable. So Theodore did what many trauma victims do. He created a narrative that justified his suffering. He decided that the prototype wasn't just a savior, but a god. His transformation wasn't torture, it was ascension. The other experiments weren't victims. They were blessed followers who'd been chosen for the higher purpose. Playcare wasn't a prison. It was a holy site where the faithful gathered under divine protection. This religious reframing allowed Theodore to function despite his trauma, but it also made him monstrously dangerous. Audio logs feature Leith Pierre speaking to Catnap, discussing how Theodore initially struggled to get along with children after his transformation. But look at him now, Pierre notes with satisfaction. The kids love him. They love the red smoke. The implication is chilling. Catnap learned to use his gas production abilities to make children compliant, knocking them unconscious nightly while he stood guard, and his blank eyes watching over drugged orphans who couldn't flee, even if they woke. Theodore's worship of the prototype intensified over the years, evolving from grateful devotion into full religious zealotry. He created shrines throughout Playcare, collecting body parts and mechanical components to construct crude idols honoring his god. The shrine visible in Chapter 3 shows a figure built from scraps, positioned in a way that suggests the prototype's characteristic pose, with graffiti declaring, "Bow to the prototype, isn't he wonderful?" The cartoons and promotional material featuring Catnap's smiling face, the posters declaring Catnap is your friend, these took on sinister meaning, knowing Theodore lurked behind them. Every cheerful image of the purple cat was a lie, propaganda that masked the reality of a broken child-turned-monster patrolling halls where other children waited to become monsters themselves. Catnap's role expanded beyond Playcare when the prototype began planning the Hour of Joy. As one of the most intelligent and loyal experiments, Theodore became key to the rebellion's execution. But his participation wasn't driven by desire for freedom or revenge against his tormentors. Catnap participated because his god commanded it, because he believed the massacre would be the first step towards some promised paradise only the prototype understood. On the morning of August 8th, 1995, before the Hour of Joy began, Catnap had a specific task: protect the orphans. While other experiments would slaughter everyone in the factory, Theodore used his red smoke to sedate all remaining children in Playcare, then hid them deeper in the facility where the violence couldn't reach them. This action reveals the complexity of his character. He'd become a murderous zealot, but some fragment of Theodore's original nature persisted, a part that still wanted to protect the vulnerable even as he enabled mass murder. After the hour of joy, when Playtime Company closed and the experiments were left alone in the factory, Catnap took control of Playcare completely. He appointed himself high priest of a death cult centered on prototype worship, declaring Playcare his territory and punishing any experiment who dared defy his god. The smiling critters, who'd been fellow experiments and possibly even friends, resisted Catnap's control. Dog Day explicitly stated they tried to oppose the prototype's dominance. Theodore's response to this resistance was torture and mutilation. He systematically destroyed the other smiling critters, saving Dog Day for last as an example. He cut off Dog Day's legs, hollowed out his torso, and allowed parasitic ruined critters to infest his body, keeping him alive through it all. On Dog Day was imprisoned in a cell where he could do nothing but suffer and wait for death that wouldn't come, his continued existence serving as a warning to any other experiments who might consider defiance. The psychological profile that emerges from Catnap's actions is deeply disturbing. Theodore had completely surrendered his individual will to his concept of the prototype. He wasn't making conscious choices anymore. He was following what he believed were divine commands, and this meant he could justify any action, any horror, by framing it as service to his god. The orphans he'd once protected became tools for red smoke testing. The friends he'd known as experiments became heretics who deserved punishment. His own humanity, already destroyed by transformation, was further eroded by religious fervor that eliminated any possibility of redemption. Chapter 3's gameplay forces players to navigate Playcare while hunted by Catnap, and the encounter reveals how Theodore experienced his existence. He stalks from the shadows, always watching but rarely attacking directly. He tests players with nightmarish visions induced by red smoke, forcing them through hallucinatory mazes where perception itself becomes unreliable. These aren't random monster behaviors. They're expressions of Catnap's fractured psyche, his need to control others' reality the way his own reality was controlled. The final confrontation with Catnap is brutally ironic. After players defeat him by using his own red smoke against him, electrocuting him with the supercharged green hand, echoing his original electrocution during escape, Theodore lies wounded, engulfed in flames but still alive. In his last moments, the prototype appears, reaching down toward his most loyal follower. Catnap rises to his knees, perhaps expecting salvation or recognition for his service. Instead, the prototype impales Catnap through the chest and drags his body away, just another piece of salvage to be harvested like all the other experiments. Theodore's god, the being he'd worshipped for years, killed him without hesitation or ceremony. Whether this was mercy killing or simple resource collection doesn't matter. The result is the same. Catnap's faith was rewarded with abandonment and death. The tragedy of Theodore Grambel epitomizes everything wrong with the bigger body's initiative. He was a scared child who tried to escape, got punished for that attempt with transformation into a monster, then coped with his trauma by embracing the very system that tortured him. He became a tool of his own oppression, enforcing the rules of a prison he could have helped destroy. And in the end, his loyalty meant nothing to the entity he'd sacrificed everything to serve. The hour of joy, 1 hour of systematic slaughter, August 8th, 1995, had dawned like any other day at Playtime Company. Employees arrived for their shifts, scientists checked on experiments, counselors prepared activities for Playcare orphans. At 10:45 in the morning, a train carrying experiment 1172 Kissy Missy departed for a routine relocation to Playcare. Everything seemed normal, another day in the factory's operation. In 15 minutes, everything would change. At exactly 11 o'clock a.m., an unknown entity, presumably the prototype or Catnap, cut Kissy Missy's restraining straps and killed the employees guarding her on the train. This attack, carefully timed and coordinated, served as the signal. Throughout the entire factory complex, hundreds of experiments received the same command: kill everyone. The hour of joy had begun. The name itself is grimly ironic, a phrase chosen by the prototype to frame the massacre as celebration rather than slaughter. After years of torture, transformation, and then imprisonment, the experiments would finally experience joy through violence against their captors. The fact that they called it this, that they needed to reframe mass murder as happiness, reveals how thoroughly their psychology had been damaged by what Playtime Company had done to them. The massacre began simultaneously across multiple locations, suggesting careful planning and coordination. In the main lobby, Experiment 1170, Huggy Wuggy, burst from his security post and began attacking employees. Security camera footage shows him biting off heads with casual efficiency, his massive jaws crushing skulls as workers fled in terror. His blue fur became stained red within minutes as he moved through the entrance area, killing anyone attempting to escape to the surface. At the game station, Experiment 1222, Mommy Longlegs used her extendable limbs to grab fleeing employees. Her elastic plastic arms stretched across vast distances, snatching victims and either slamming them against walls or dropping them from lethal heights. The few seconds of video footage shows her lifting multiple people. At least 21 bodies were later found in the area, some thrown against stairs with such force their bones shattered, others killed by red smoke inhalation or direct physical attack. But Catnap's primary focus wasn't adults, it was the orphans. Following orders from the prototype, he used his gas to sedate all remaining children, then moved them deeper into the facility, hiding them in the labs where the violence couldn't reach them. This mercy, if it can be called that, meant the orphans survived physically, but had to live with the knowledge of what happened. At the water treatment facility, the smiling critters who participated in the hour of joy tore apart employees with animalistic savagery. Smaller experiments, the mini huggies and ruined critters, swarmed victims in packs, overwhelming them through sheer numbers. Miss Delight and her sisters chased a man into a room, their identical faces twisted in expressions that survived in the final security footage. Experiment 1160 Boxy Boo fulfilled his role as executioner with mechanical efficiency. Multiple bodies were found torn apart or stuffed into his trash compactor torso, crushed beyond recognition. Some victims were eaten alive. Boxy Boo's patient hunting style, allowing him to corner fleeing employees and devour them slowly while they screamed. The make-a-friend room, the game station testing areas, the manufacturing floors, everywhere humans worked became killing zones. The bodies piled up so quickly that later reports couldn't establish exact casualty counts, settling for estimates. at least 58 in the make-a-friend room, at least 57 in the game station proper, at least 74 in Playcare. Conservative estimates put the total death toll at several hundred people, though the true number might never be known. Emergency alert systems triggered throughout the facility, and klaxons blaring warnings that an evacuation was necessary. But the alerts came too late. The experiments blocked escape routes, hunting employees through corridors and rooms with methodical thoroughness. A few people managed to reach areas near the main entrance and fled to safety, including Leith Pierre and someone identified only as PW. But the vast majority never made it out. The audio recordings from that day are haunting. One scientist managed to create a final log while dying, undocumenting the prototype's abilities and warning future researchers about containment failures. His voice grows weaker as he speaks, the sounds of screaming and violence audible in the background. He knows he's going to die, but he's still trying to help the company understand what went wrong, still faithful to scientific documentation, even as monsters tear apart his co-workers just outside his door. Poppy Playtime, trapped in her display case and unable to see what was happening, and could hear everything. In Chapter 3, she recounts the experience with audible trauma. She heard every moment of the massacre, the agonizingly long duration, the screams of people trying to hide or run or stay alive. She remembered their cries. What's going on? Why is this happening? What are those things? The innocent alongside the guilty, everyone slaughtered indiscriminately. This point, that the experiments killed everyone regardless of culpability, represents one of the story's most tragic elements. Certainly many victims deserve death. The scientists who'd performed transformations, the executives who'd approved the Bigger Bodies initiative, anyone directly involved in the suffering of orphans. But janitors died too. Cafeteria workers, security guards who'd never been told about the experiments, administrative staff who'd processed paperwork without understanding what it meant. Even visitors and children from the public tour program were killed if they happened to be in the factory that day. The indiscriminate nature of the slaughter reveals how thoroughly the experiment's humanity had been destroyed. They couldn't distinguish between guilty and innocent anymore, couldn't recognize that some employees were as much victims of corporate horror as the experiments themselves. Everyone associated with Playtime Company became the enemy, and the hour of joy became a purge that eliminated any possibility of mercy or justice. The massacre lasted approximately 1 hour, hence the name. During that time, the experiments maintained coordinated attacks across the massive factory complex, suggesting ongoing communication or very detailed planning. The prototype himself remained distant, watching from safety rather than participating directly. This removal from the violence is telling. He'd orchestrated everything, unplanned the rebellion, convinced desperate experiments that this was their path to freedom, but he didn't risk himself in the execution. After the killing stopped, after the last screams faded and the experiment stood surrounded by corpses, came the aftermath that Poppy's testimony makes clear. The bodies needed disposal, evidence of the massacre hidden away where investigators would never find them. The experiments, following either orders or instinct, had dragged the corpses down to the deepest levels of the facility, to areas beneath Playcare and the production floors where tunnels led into darkness. Then came the most disturbing detail of all. They ate the bodies, not from malice or horror movie monstrousness, but from desperate necessity. The experiments required massive amounts of food to survive, And with the hour of joy ending human oversight, no one remained to feed them. The corpses represented not just evidence disposal, but a food source that would allow the experiments to survive in their sealed prison. Poppy explicitly states this, her voice breaking with grief, and they ate the bodies to stay alive. Think about what this means for the experiments. Many retained enough humanity to remember being human, to understand what they were doing. They had to consume the people who tormented them, yes, but also the innocent workers who'd shown them kindness. They had to chew flesh that tasted like their own species' meat, knowing they'd been reduced to cannibalism through the same transformations that necessitated this horror. Every meal became a reminder of what they'd lost. The hour of joy's aftermath reshaped the factory into a tomb. Playtime Company closed immediately, unable to continue operations with its entire workforce dead. The few survivors who'd escaped spread rumors about what happened, but without bodies or evidence, and official investigations couldn't prove anything. The factory was simply abandoned, its massive underground complex left sealed with all its secrets and surviving experiments trapped inside. For the experiments, the hour of joy turned out to be a trap disguised as freedom. The prototype had promised them liberation, told them that killing their tormentors would lead to some better existence. Instead, they found themselves in an even worse prison. Abandoned in a massive facility with no way out, and no food source except the gradually diminishing corpses and whatever smaller toys they could catch. No purpose or future except survival. The toys that had been promised joy through violence discovered that murder doesn't heal trauma, that revenge doesn't restore what was taken. They'd killed hundreds of people and gained nothing but isolation and guilt for those who retained enough conscience to feel it. The hour of joy's name became increasingly bitter as days turned to months, turned to years, as the experiments realized they'd traded one form of captivity for another, and this time there was no one coming to feed them. By 2005, 10 years after the massacre, the experiments had degraded into desperate, half-starved creatures struggling to survive. Some had turned on each other, resorting to cannibalism of smaller toys. Others huddled in specific territories, protecting hoarded resources. A few, like Miss Delight, had descended into complete madness, and their sanity eroded by isolation and hunger. The hour of joy hadn't freed them. It had simply replaced their human captors with the tyranny of the prototype and condemned them to a slow death through starvation. The prototype, victim, monster, God. To understand the complete darkness of Poppy Playtime, you must understand Experiment 1006, the entity known as the prototype, and born from a boy named Oliver Ludwig, who'd been adopted by Elliot Ludwig specifically to serve as experimental material. The prototype represents the logical endpoint of Playtime Company's horror. A victim so thoroughly damaged that he became a monster far worse than his creators. A being who suffered unimaginable torture and responded by inflicting that suffering on everyone around him. Oliver's early life remains largely mysterious, but recent revelations from Chapter 5 confirm his identity as Ludwig's adopted son. Whether Oliver was adopted legitimately or essentially purchased from an orphanage to serve as test material, the result was the same. A trusting child brought into a home where he'd be used as proof of concept for bringing back Ludwig's dead daughter. Oliver was kind, intelligent, exactly the sort of person who'd believe Ludwig genuinely cared about him, making the betrayal even more devastating. The transformation procedure that created the prototype was more primitive than later Bigger Bodies experiments. taking place before Sawyer's techniques had been refined. This might explain why the prototype's final form differs so dramatically from later experiments. By Chapter 5, he's revealed as a nightmarish fusion of jester and spider, with a three-pronged hat, skeletal limbs ending in sharp claws, and a lower half that merges into a massive spider-like machine body built from factory parts. His torso houses a faintly glowing core, visible through emaciated flesh that barely covers mechanical components beneath. But the most disturbing aspect of his appearance comes from his habit of collecting and integrating parts from other experiments. The prototype has Mommy Longleg's arm, allowing him to stretch and grab like she could. He has limbs from both Huggy Wuggy and Kissy Missy, granting him their strength and grip. He wears Catnap's skinned fur and gas production equipment on his back, enabling him to emit red smoke. Each component represents an experiment he's killed or harvested, his body becoming a grotesque amalgamation of his victim's abilities. The prototype's intelligence proved unprecedented from the start. Audio logs detail how he deceived researchers, crafted escape tools from his alarm clock and other materials, manipulated staff into complacency. But in log 24,459, he speaks for the first time, but not in his own voice. Instead, he replays recordings of various employees, mimicking their speech patterns perfectly, using their own words to mock them. When Harley Sawyer comments that he learned something new about the prototype at each meeting, the entity sarcastically thanks him and repeats his words back in Sawyer's exact voice. If this voice mimicry ability becomes central to understanding the prototype's methods, he doesn't just physically collect parts from other experiments, he absorbs their voices, their mannerisms, their memories. When he later impersonates Ollie to guide the player through Chapter 3, his deception is perfect because he's speaking with Oliver's voice processed through Theodore's, layering identities to create a false persona that seems trustworthy. The prototype's personality is built entirely on hatred and spite toward Playtime Company, but also toward his own situation. He knows he was a stepping stone, that Ludwig only cared about perfecting the technique to resurrect Poppy. This knowledge created deep resentment toward his sister, though his feelings manifest as twisted possessive obsession rather than simple hatred. He kills loyal followers like Catnap without hesitation, yet he's also deeply focused on Poppy and unable to ignore his connection to the only other experiment who shares his origin. During his confinement before the Hour of Joy, the prototype developed escape plans that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of human psychology and facility systems. He fashioned a laser pointer device from components, used it to blind cameras and manipulate security protocols. He observed patterns in staff behavior, learning schedules and vulnerabilities. Most importantly, he began communicating with other experiments, planting ideas of rebellion while positioning himself as their savior and leader. The relationship between the prototype and the other experiments reveals his manipulation skills. To desperate, suffering creatures like Catnap, he presented himself as God and protector, someone who'd save them from their torment. To more resistant experiments, he used intimidation and violence, demonstrating that defiance would be punished worse than cooperation. He created a hierarchy with himself at the apex, turning the experiment's prison into his kingdom. When the prototype finally escaped confinement, he didn't flee the factory. Instead, he began orchestrating the Hour of Joy, a rebellion that served his purposes rather than actually freeing the experiments. The evidence suggests he understood from the beginning that the massacre would leave everyone trapped in the facility. He knew the experiments would be forced to consume corpses to survive, and that they'd gradually starve as food sources ran out, that they'd be completely under his control with nowhere to go. After the hour of joy, the prototype established himself as supreme authority over the factory. He collected the orphans from Playcare and took them to the labs, where his plans for them remain ambiguous. Poppy states they're alive but sleeping, while the prototype later suggests he's experimented on them and they're in a better place, which might mean death or worse. The uncertainty is deliberate, keeping everyone ignorant of his full intentions. His treatment of other experiments reveals his true nature. When Dog Day and the smiling critters resisted his control, the prototype didn't simply kill them. He tortured them, allowing Catnap to mutilate and destroy them as examples of what happened to Defiance. When Mommy Longlegs died in Chapter 2, the prototype immediately collected her body, harvesting parts before the corpse cooled. Each death became an opportunity to increase his own power, absorbing the capabilities of the fallen. The most disturbing evidence of the prototype's nature comes from the wrong side out experiments described in Chapter 5. Some toys were apparently turned inside out as punishment or experimentation, their bodies literally inverted with internal organs and tissues forced to the exterior while their skin faced inward. Giblet, one of these reversed creatures, describes the experience with obvious trauma. Whether the prototype developed this technique himself or learned it from Playtime scientists doesn't matter. The fact that he uses it reveals him as torturer rather than liberator. Chapter 5's revelations about the prototype's motivations recontextualize everything. He wasn't trying to destroy Playtime Company out of righteous anger or to free fellow victims. His actions were driven by resentment toward Poppy, possessive sibling obsession, and an desire for control. He orchestrated the hour of joy, knowing it would trap everyone under his authority. He collected orphans knowing he could experiment on them without oversight. He built a cult of personality around himself, becoming the very thing he'd supposedly rebelled against, an authority figure who experiments on helpless subjects. The parallel to Elliot Ludwig becomes impossible to ignore. Ludwig used orphans as experimental subjects to resurrect his daughter, imbuing children as means to an end. The prototype uses everyone around him, experiments and orphans alike, as tools to satisfy his need for control and revenge. Both claim their actions serve higher purposes, Ludwig seeking to cheat death, the prototype claiming to liberate victims. But both are fundamentally selfish, sacrificing others to address their own trauma without regard for the suffering they cause. When the prototype finally appears fully in Chapter 5, his design reinforces his role as monstrous authority. The jester motif suggests a trickster figure, someone who plays games with others' lives. The spider body evokes predators who trap victims in webs, sitting at the center of a network they control completely. The collected body parts from other experiments make him a grotesque collage of everyone he's consumed, a physical manifestation of how he's built himself through others' destruction. His interaction with Poppy during Chapter 5's climax reveals the depth of his obsession. When he breaks her face, perhaps accidentally, he seems shocked. Despite everything, despite claiming she's just another experiment, she matters to him in ways he can't control. She's his sister, created from the same process, the only being who truly understands his origin. He resents her but can't let her go, a toxic relationship that mirrors how abuse victims sometimes fixate on their abusers. The most horrifying realization about the prototype is that his suffering doesn't excuse his actions. Yes, Oliver Ludwig was an innocent child betrayed and tortured. Yes, the prototype endured unimaginable pain at the hands of Playtime scientists. But his response to that trauma was to recreate the same systems that destroyed him, to become a new authority who experiments on and controls others, to perpetuate the cycle rather than breaking it. He's proof that victimhood doesn't automatically create moral authority, that suffering can transform people into monsters as easily as it can create empathy. The factory under the prototype's rule isn't better than it was under Playtime Company. It's arguably worse because now there's no one coming to feed the experiments, no outside world to eventually intervene, no hope of escape or rescue. The experiments traded human oppressors for one of their own, who's even more brutal because he knows exactly how to hurt them, having experienced the same torture himself. The darkest secrets, hidden in plain sight. Beyond the obvious horrors of transformation and massacre, Poppy Playtime contains layers of additional darkness that emerge only through careful examination of documents, audio logs, and environmental storytelling. These secrets reveal depths of depravity that make the Bigger Bodies initiative seem almost straightforward by comparison. The theatre incident stands as one of the most catastrophic failures in Playtime Company history, though details remain deliberately obscure. On March 20th, 1989, Leith Pierre's 26th day on the job, an incident in the facility led to at least 70 tourists and 12 factory employees being killed. The investigation concluded that Dr. Harley Sawyer, then a prominent scientist, was responsible due to negligence, though the specific circumstances aren't fully documented. What happened in that theatre? The few clues suggest some kind of demonstration or show involving experiments went catastrophically wrong, possibly an experiment breaking containment or a system failing during a public presentation. The casualty count implies people were trapped or unable to escape, dying en masse in a confined space. Sawyer's responsibility suggests he either failed to properly contain an experiment or approved a demonstration that should have been recognized as dangerous. The consequences of the theatre incident reveal how Playtime Company handled internal disasters. Rather than face accountability, Sawyer was forcibly transformed into Experiment 1354, known as the Doctor. His consciousness was uploaded into the facility's computer systems, and making him a digital entity that could continue working without physical form. This wasn't justice or even punishment. It was conversion of a liability into an asset, ensuring Sawyer's scientific knowledge remained accessible while removing any possibility of him testifying about what happened. The process of turning Sawyer into the Doctor represents another advancement in Playtime's experimental techniques. Consciousness digitization. If they could upload human minds to computers, separate from biological bodies entirely, the implications are staggering. How many other employees were digitized and erased from records? Did subjects retain full awareness in their digital prisons, or were they reduced to programs that only approximated consciousness? The Doctor's eventual revival in Chapter 5 suggests that digitization preserves something, but whether that something is truly Sawyer, or just an approximation wearing his knowledge, is an open question. The resource extraction specialists represent another overlooked horror. After the hour of joy, Leith Pierre sent teams of these workers into the factory to collect toy parts from puzzle pillars, materials needed to build more experiments. These specialists knew they were entering a factory full of murderous creatures, but they went anyway, presumably because they were paid extremely well, or threatened with consequences if they refused. The prototype sent experiments like Huggy Wuggy, a Mommy Long Legs, and Boxy Boo to stop the resource extraction specialists, killing them and feeding their bodies to starving smaller experiments. This created a grim cycle. Playtime sent in workers to collect materials. The prototype killed them to feed his followers. The company sent more workers. The prototype killed them too. Eventually, the company stopped sending people. But by then, dozens of resource extraction specialists had died, their bodies processed through the factory's food chain. Think about the calculation involved in sending workers to their deaths. Someone at Playtime Company, probably Leith Pierre, decided that collecting toy parts was worth sacrificing human lives. Each team sent in knew what happened to previous teams, but the missions continued until the resources no longer justified the casualties. The resource extraction specialists weren't scientists or executives whose guilt complicated their victimhood, and they were likely working-class people taking dangerous jobs because they needed money, making them some of the purest victims in the entire story. The starvation of experiments represents ongoing horror that stretches across 10 years. After the hour of joy, the creatures trapped in the factory had to find food wherever possible. Initially, there were corpses from the massacre. Once those were consumed, the experiments began eating smaller toys, including mini Huggies, ruined critters, and other mass-produced creatures. Eventually, they turned on each other. The Mr. Light's cannibalism of their sister units demonstrates this desperation. These teacher experiments, identical sisters created together, held out as long as they could before hunger drove them to attack each other. The survivor describes the experience with obvious psychological trauma, guilt and horror at eating her own family warring with the biological imperative to survive. By the time players encounter her in Chapter 3, she's completely broken. Barely functional as madness and starvation have eroded her sanity. Consider what 10 years of this existence means for the experiments. Every day is a struggle to find food. Every interaction with another experiment becomes potential threat or opportunity depending on who's stronger. The factory that once rang with children's laughter and toy production now echoes with the sounds of creatures hunting, eating, and dying slowly. This is the true price of the prototype's liberation. He freed the experiments from human control only to subject them to gradual death through starvation. The red smoke's full effects extend far beyond simple sedation. Originally developed to help orphans sleep, the substance causes severe nightmares and psychological damage over extended exposure. Marie Payne documented her terror of the nightmares in transfer requests. "I'm begging to be moved away from areas where red smoke was regularly deployed." But she wasn't transferred, and her ongoing exposure likely contributed to the psychological instability that made Mommy Long Legs so dangerous after transformation. The curriculum at Playcare's school taught children that self-sacrifice for science was noble. But the deeper horror lies in how effectively this indoctrination worked. Some orphans genuinely believed transformation would be an honor, and that giving their bodies to the Bigger Bodies initiative would make them heroes. They walked willingly to the surgical theaters, perhaps even excited to finally have purpose and value. The betrayal they must have felt when they understood the truth, when transformation began and they realized what heroism actually meant, adds another layer of psychological devastation to their physical torture. The scale of Playtime Company's underground facility suggests far more experiments and the horrors than players have yet encountered. The factory extends deep beneath the surface, with multiple levels, vast caverns, endless corridors. The areas explored through Chapter 5 represent only a fraction of the complex. What other experiments lurk in sealed sections? What other crimes are hidden in collapsed tunnels? The factory becomes less a building and more a monument to corporate evil, on every square foot dedicated to some aspect of human exploitation. The relationship between Playtime Company and Warrenbuck Construction adds corporate conspiracy dimensions. Warrenbuck built facilities knowing their purpose, constructing surgical theaters and containment cells and secret tunnels designed specifically for human experimentation. Someone at Warrenbuck received blueprints that clearly indicated illegal activity and decided profit mattered more than law or ethics, and the construction workers who built these spaces saw what they were creating, but either didn't care or were too intimidated to report it. The casual destruction of evidence and disposal of bodies reveals how thoroughly normalized horror became at Playtime Company. When experiments failed, when procedures went wrong, when employees learned too much, bodies disappeared into boxy boo, or were buried in sealed sections. There are no records, no paper trails, and just empty rooms and bloodstains that might be paint. The company operated with such confidence in its ability to conceal crimes that it conducted mass experimentation for years without serious fear of discovery. The transformation process's memory manipulation technology enables horrors beyond what's been shown. Scientists could selectively erase traumatic memories, making subjects forget their own torture while retaining skills and knowledge. They could implant false memories by creating experiments who believed they'd always been toys. They could copy consciousnesses, potentially creating multiple versions of the same person with different personalities or experiences. The ethical implications are nightmare fuel. How many experiments died still believing the company's lies? How many woke up after transformation convinced they'd volunteered? And the fact that Elliot Ludwig conducted his initial experiments in complete secrecy from his own company's leadership suggests he had access to hidden facilities that might predate the main factory. Where did he transform Oliver and Poppy? Were there earlier test subjects whose failures were destroyed before the prototype succeeded? Ludwig's estate contained the body of an eviscerated child, implying he attempted resurrection there. But was that where the initial poppy flower experiments occurred, and the origin of the horror might extend beyond the factory into residential spaces, meaning Ludwig's home itself could be a sealed tomb full of failed experiments? The psychological profiles of scientists like Harley Sawyer reveal mundane motivations behind exceptional evil. Sawyer wanted recognition and fame, believing his experiments would revolutionize science and secure his legacy. He wasn't a cackling supervillain. He was an arrogant academic who convinced himself that any cost was acceptable if the research succeeded. This banality of evil, normal people making choices that destroy lives, appears throughout Playtime Company's history. Most employees probably rationalize their participation as just doing their jobs, following orders, advancing their careers. The cumulative effect of thousands of small compromises created industrial-scale atrocity, the player's terrifying connection. The identity of the player character has been one of Poppy Playtime's most persistent mysteries, with theories ranging from former employees to revenge seekers to experiments themselves. Chapter 5's revelations fundamentally change this mystery by suggesting something far darker. The player isn't simply a survivor of the hour of joy. They're connected to the experiments in ways that make them less investigator and more specimen, and the letter that draws the player back to the factory remains suspicious. It claims to be from missing employees, stating, "Everyone thinks the staff disappeared 10 years ago. We're still here." But Chapter 3 confirms all adult staff died during the hour of joy, so the letter can't be from employees. The most likely culprit is the prototype, who has voice mimicry abilities and could have forged a letter that would compel the player's return. The question is, why that specific person? Throughout the game, the player demonstrates abilities that seem unusual for a random former employee. They're exceptionally good at the game station tests, completing challenges designed to identify superior orphan candidates. They adapt quickly to using the grab pack, mastering complex puzzle solving that requires spatial reasoning and physical coordination beyond normal human capabilities. They survive encounters with experiments that should kill them easily, and showing reflexes and endurance that don't match an ordinary person's abilities. Chapter 5 provides the smoking gun that reframes everything. During a confrontation with the prototype, the player is critically wounded and thrown into a vat of poppy gel. This substance, which binds human tissue to synthetic materials and maintains life in impossible circumstances, should have killed them or transformed them. Instead, when Giblet pulls them out and shocks them with his staff, the player survives and returns to consciousness. Poppy's monologue during this scene implies a shared telepathic or biological link with the player. She states the player needs the poppy gel to survive, suggesting they're not fully human. The vat wasn't an execution method. It was a terrifying confirmation of the player's anatomy. They're compatible with poppy gel in ways that only experiments are. When Giblet jumpstarts them, he's not performing CPR on a human, and he's rebooting a gel-infused biomechanical heart. This revelation recontextualizes everything about the player's journey. Why weren't they at the factory during the hour of joy, despite supposedly being an employee? Possible answer: they were an experiment who'd been moved elsewhere, placed in a situation outside the facility when the massacre occurred. Why did the letter specifically target them? Because the prototype knew what they were and wanted to draw them back for reasons connected to their nature as an experiment. The player's exceptional performance at game station tests suddenly makes sense if they were originally a Playcare orphan who underwent testing before transformation. Their muscle memory and problem-solving abilities retained from childhood, combined with the enhancements of their experimental nature, would explain their success. Their survival of injuries that should be fatal becomes less plot armor and more biological reality. Poppy gel keeps them alive the same way it preserves all bigger bodies. But this raises horrifying questions about the player's awareness. Do they know what they are? The game never shows the player looking at their hands or seeing their reflection, suggesting possible avoidance of confronting their appearance. When other experiments encounter them, do they recognize a fellow creation? A Poppy and the prototype both treat the player as special, different from the random humans who died during the hour of joy, implying they see something the player hasn't acknowledged. The possibility that the player is PW, one of the known survivors of the hour of joy, adds another dimension. PW could be someone who was transformed before the massacre, sent away as part of an experiment to see if bigger bodies could function in outside society, then recalled after the factory closed. Their survival wouldn't be luck or coincidence, but rather because experiments were specifically ordered to avoid killing them. Another theory suggests the player might be Leith Pierre, the executive who survived the hour of joy and sent resource extraction specialists into the factory afterward. If Pierre had undergone some form of experimental enhancement, perhaps testing a less extreme transformation process, and it would explain both his survival and his willingness to send others into danger afterward. But this theory struggles with the timeline and the player's evident lack of knowledge about the factory's secrets. The "you were supposed to be here" message that plays in reverse during Chapter 3's hallucination sequence takes on new meaning with the poppy gel revelation. Your presence was demanded 10 years ago and you didn't show up. 8/8/1995. You were supposed to be here. Why weren't you here? You missed the event. You missed the meeting. You missed the party. This sounds less like condemnation for not being killed, and more like accusation that the player missed their role in the hour of joy itself. If the player is an experiment, were they supposed to participate in the massacre? Were they transformed before the hour of joy, but removed from the facility for testing in outside environments, then recalled too late to join the rebellion? Their absence might have been noticed by the prototype, who expected them to be part of the coordinated attack. The resentment in the reversed message suggests someone angry. The player didn't fulfill expected obligations, rather than simply survived. The relationship between Poppy and the player becomes more complex if they're both experiments created by Ludwig. Poppy refers to herself and the prototype as the truly immortal experiments, different from the bigger bodies who require food and suffer biological degradation. Does the player share this immortality? If they're another of Ludwig's early experiments, created using similar methods to Poppy, it would explain why she treats them as potential allies rather than just tools. The player's apparent lack of memory about their own nature suggests either memory manipulation or psychological denial. If scientists erased their memories of transformation and implanted false memories of being a normal employee, the player could have lived years believing they were human. The return to the factory might trigger gradual memory recovery, explaining why they keep pushing forward despite danger. Some subconscious part remembers belonging here. Alternatively, the player might be fully aware of what they are but choosing to remain silent. An interpretation supported by their complete lack of verbal communication throughout the game. They never speak, never express surprise at revelations, never question the horrors they encounter. This silence could reflect acceptance of their nature, awareness that they're as much a monster as the things hunting them. The implications of a player's experiment interpretation extend to game mechanics. The grab pack's integration with the player character seems unusually seamless, as if they're particularly compatible with Playtime technology. Their ability to absorb massive electrical shocks that would kill humans, survive falls from deadly heights, endure injuries that would incapacitate normal people. All of this becomes evidence of experimental enhancement rather than video game logic. The ending of Chapter 5, with the player activating the master backup and encountering the Doctor, suggests they're being drawn deeper into understanding their nature. Each chapter strips away more pretense, revealing additional layers of truth about what the player is and what their relationship to this horror truly represents. By the time the story concludes, the player might discover they weren't investigating Playtime Company's crimes. They were one of those crimes given just enough freedom to forget what they'd become. 10 years of living hell, the period between August 8th, 1995, Sam and the player's return in 2005 represents a decade of suffering that often gets overshadowed by the dramatic events of the Hour of Joy and the player's journey. But understanding what the experiments endured during those 10 years of isolation reveals the true scope of Poppy Playtime's horror. Not the sudden violence of transformation or massacre, but the slow, grinding torture of abandonment. The immediate aftermath of the Hour of Joy must have been chaotic. Hundreds of experiments scattered throughout the factory, their frenzy of violence subsiding as the last humans died, leaving them alone with corpses and silence. The elation some might have felt at destroying their tormentors would have quickly faded as reality set in. The doors were sealed, the surface inaccessible, the outside world completely out of reach. They'd traded human imprisonment for isolation, and soon they'd discover this new prison was even worse. Food became the first critical issue. The experiments required substantial nutrition to sustain their enlarged biological bodies, and with the factory closed, no supply chain existed to feed them. The corpses from the massacre provided initial sustenance, but there were hundreds of experiments and only hundreds of bodies. Even practicing strict rationing, the meat wouldn't last more than months before decomposition made it inedible. Cannibalism among the toys followed inevitably. The smaller mass-produced creatures like mini Huggies and ruined critters became prey for larger experiments. Huggy Wuggy and others hunted these lesser toys, consuming them to stave off starvation. But the mini Huggies weren't just prey. They were also former orphans, smaller transformations created through the same processes. Every meal was technically cannibalism. Creatures eating other creatures they might have known as children in Playcare, so the psychological impact of this necessity destroyed many experiments remaining sanity. Miss Delight's descent into madness came from eating her identical sisters, teacher experiments who'd been created together and worked together, now forced to consume each other when starvation became unbearable. The last surviving Miss Delight in Chapter 3 is barely coherent, trauma and guilt having shattered her mind. She attacks the player not from hatred, but from desperation, and another source of food in a world where food has become impossibly scarce. Territorial control emerged as experiments established domains within the factory. Huggy Wuggy claimed the entrance areas, his security programming making him a guardian of the sealed doors. Mommy Longlegs controlled the game station, perhaps drawn to the place where she'd once supervised children before her transformation. Catnap ruled Playcare absolutely, turning his former home into a temple for prototype worship. Each territory became fiercely defended, experiments unable to trust each other anymore. The prototype established himself as supreme authority, but his control meant subjugation rather than protection. He demanded absolute loyalty, killing or torturing any experiment who defied him. Dog Day and the Smiling Critter's resistance led to systematic torture, with Dog Day imprisoned, mutilated, and left to suffer as an example. This reign of terror meant experiments had to choose between submission to the prototype or isolation and eventual starvation. The experiments who retained more humanity suffered additional psychological torture. Creatures like Kissy Missy, who retained memories of who they'd been, lived with constant awareness of their lost identities. They could remember parents, friends, lives before Playcare. They knew they'd once been human, but could never return to that state. This knowledge without possibility of restoration is arguably worse than complete memory loss, consciousness trapped in a body that will never feel right. The decay of the factory itself added environmental horror to biological suffering. With no maintenance, the facility gradually deteriorated. Water damage from burst pipes, electrical failures causing darkness in sections where lights had always burned, structural instabilities creating cave-ins and blocked passages. The factory became increasingly hostile even as a physical environment, as if the building itself was dying alongside its inhabitants. The orphans taken to the labs by the prototype represent perhaps the cruelest aspect of this decade. Poppy claims they're alive but sleeping, kept in some kind of suspended state. But why? What purpose does keeping orphans in stasis serve? The most likely explanation, given the prototype's nature, is that he's experimenting on them, continuing the very practices Playtime Company used on him and other experiments. Think about what this means for those orphans. They were children during the hour of joy, traumatized by witnessing the massacre even though they weren't directly harmed. Then they were taken to the labs and placed in suspension, possibly subjected to continued experimentation, denied even the mercy of death or the possibility of growth. By 2005, they'd have been adults if allowed to age normally, but instead, they're locked in childhood, preserved in whatever state the prototype decided was most useful. The experiment's gradual physical deterioration added medical horror to their suffering. Without access to proper maintenance, injuries wouldn't heal correctly. Poppy gel's preservative properties kept them alive, but didn't prevent damage from accumulating. By the time players encounter experiments in 2005, many show signs of degradation. Exposed metal endoskeletons and torn fur revealing flesh beneath, mechanical components that grind and spark, bodies held together by improvised repairs. Some experiments chose suicide, though their biology made this nearly impossible. Poppy gel's life-sustaining properties meant standard methods of death didn't work reliably. An experiment could sever limbs, damage vital systems, yet remain conscious and suffering. The factory might contain the remains of experiments who attempted self-destruction but failed, are locked in damaged bodies that wouldn't let them die, existing in permanent agony. The psychological coping mechanisms experiments developed to survive 10 years of this horror varied widely. Catnap embraced religious fanaticism, reframing his suffering as divine purpose. Mommy Longlegs channeled her trauma into violent obsession with games and rules. Huggy Wuggy seemed to operate on pure aggressive instinct. Consciousness degraded to animal-level awareness. Each adaptation was a tragedy, showing how the mind breaks when subjected to prolonged, unbearable conditions. The passage of time itself became another form of torture. Experiments with enough intelligence to track days and years watched the calendar march forward without hope of change or rescue. Every sunrise that filtered down through the factory's upper levels marked another day of hunger, another day of isolation, another day trapped in a body that wasn't theirs. Some 10 years of this created despair so profound that some experiments probably welcomed the player's arrival as potential death, an ending to consciousness that had become unbearable. The starvation's progression through the decade can be tracked through environmental evidence. Early areas show signs of organization, experiments following habits from when the factory operated. Later areas demonstrate increasing desperation, toys torn apart and scattered, evidence of violent struggles, and bloodstains suggesting cannibalistic feeding. By the deepest sections reached in Chapter 4 and 5, the decay is total, the factory a charnel house, where even the pretense of civilization has collapsed. For Poppy, locked in her display case, the experience was different but no less horrific. She could hear everything happening in the factory, the sounds of experiments hunting each other, the occasional screams as desperation drove violence, the gradual silence as populations dwindled. But she couldn't move, couldn't act, couldn't help or escape. Just consciousness trapped in a sealed container, listening to her world die around her for 10 years straight. Conclusion: the abyss stares back. Poppy Playtime reveals itself as far darker than initial appearances suggest, because it layers horror upon horror, each revelation exposing deeper cruelty beneath. The colorful mascots and simple jump scares mask an abyss of suffering so profound that every piece of lore adds weight rather than providing closure. The foundation horror, Elliot Ludwig's secret experiments on orphan children, including his adopted son Oliver, establishes that evil wasn't introduced to Playtime Company by corrupt successors. The company was born in sin, created by a man who decided his grief justified using children as experimental material. Every subsequent atrocity flows from that original choice to value scientific achievement over human dignity. The scale of the Bigger Bodies initiative, over 1,000 confirmed transformations with possibly many more unrecorded, represents industrial processing of vulnerable children into living tools. This wasn't occasional criminal behavior, but systematic exploitation, a corporate program with training manuals and procedures, normalized horror that became routine business practice. The casual efficiency with which Playtime Company destroyed lives for profit demonstrates how easily institutions adopt evil when properly incentivized. The Hour of Joy's revelation that the rebellion itself was manipulation, experiments trading human oppression for even worse conditions under the prototype's control, shows that victimhood doesn't guarantee righteousness. The creatures had every right to revenge, but their slaughter of innocent employees and their subsequent degradation under the prototype's rule proves that violence against oppression doesn't automatically lead to freedom. Sometimes it just creates new oppressors from the ranks of the oppressed. The ongoing suffering of experiments during 10 years of abandonment, their slow starvation and psychological destruction, reveals that immediate violence isn't the only or even the worst form of horror. Prolonged existence in unbearable conditions, consciousness trapped in bodies that won't die despite desperate desire for ending, creates suffering that exceeds physical torture. The experiments can't escape, can't heal, can't even properly die. They just persist in agony. The player's probable status as an experiment themselves, suggested by the poppy gel revelations in Chapter 5, means the entire journey is less investigation and more rediscovery. We're not learning about someone else's crimes. We're confronting our own nature as one of those crimes. Every experiment we encounter represents a potential mirror, a version of what we are or might become. This removes the comfort of observer distance and implicates the player character in the horror as both victim and participant. The unknowns that remain, the orphans in the labs, the prototype's ultimate goals, the full extent of Ludwig's early experiments. I suggest the darkness extends even further than revealed. Each chapter uncovers more secrets, and each secret is worse than what came before. The pattern suggests no flaw to this horror, just deeper layers of cruelty waiting to be discovered. Poppy Playtime is darker than we thought, because it demonstrates how ordinary people with ordinary motivations create extraordinary evil when systems encourage cruelty. Ludwig wanted to save his daughter. Sawyer wanted recognition. Leith Pierre wanted to save the company. None of them were cackling supervillains. They were regular people making choices that destroyed lives. This banality makes it more disturbing because it's more real, more applicable to actual institutional horror. The franchise is darker than we thought because suffering doesn't end when the villains fall. The experiments achieved revenge during the Hour of Joy, but remained trapped and starving. They won and lost simultaneously, and their victory hollow because freedom was never actually possible. This reflects real trauma's persistence, how abuse continues affecting victims long after abusers are gone, how some damage can't be undone or healed. The story is darker than we thought because it offers no easy redemption or closure. The experiments can't become human again. The dead children can't be resurrected. The decade of suffering can't be erased. Even if the prototype is destroyed and surviving experiments are freed, there'll still be monsters forever, still carry memories of what they've done and what was done to them. Some wounds don't heal. Some innocence can't be restored. Poppy Playtime confronts players with the reality that childhood and toys, symbols of innocence and joy, can be weaponized into horror. The same building where children should have found happiness became their tomb. The same mascots designed to comfort them became their prisons. This violation of sacred spaces and symbols, the corruption of things meant to be safe, strikes deeper than generic monster attacks because it demonstrates nothing is immune to evil. The darkest aspect of all might be the systematic nature of it. This wasn't one person's madness, but institutional evil. Corporate structures enabling atrocity. Systems that rewarded cruelty and punished compassion. Employees who questioned practices were transformed or disappeared. Scientists who succeeded at creating suffering received promotions. The company's structure ensured evil would perpetuate regardless of individual moral qualms. As players descend deeper into the factory's bowels, we're not just exploring a location, but witnessing the descent of human morality when profit and ambition override ethics. Every level down represents another compromise, another line crossed, another group of victims sacrificed for advancement. The physical journey mirrors the moral one, and both end in darkness that seems bottomless. The story asks uncomfortable questions about complicity and responsibility. Every employee who stayed silent enabled the horror. Every scientist who followed orders contributed to suffering. Every orphan selected for transformation was abandoned by a society that should have protected them. The guilt spreads far beyond Playtime Company, to include everyone who could have intervened but didn't. And this horror resonates because it reflects real injustices. Corporations exploiting vulnerable populations, institutions sacrificing individuals for profit, systems grinding up the powerless while protecting the powerful. Poppy Playtime's fictional atrocities parallel actual historical horrors, making it commentary as much as entertainment. The franchise is darker than we thought, because it refuses to provide catharsis or justice. The hour of joy didn't fix anything. The player's investigation won't restore victims. The truth won't set anyone free. All it does is reveal how deep the rot goes, how thoroughly innocent intentions became corrupted, how completely the factory's victims were destroyed. Knowledge without power to change anything might be the cruelest fate of all. In the end, Poppy Playtime's darkness comes from showing us an evil that's simultaneously fantastical and familiar, impossible yet believable, lay extreme yet rooted in recognizable human failings. It's darker than we thought because the more we learn, the worse it gets. And the worst part is knowing there are still more secrets waiting to be discovered. Still more horrors lurking in sealed sections. Still more depths to plumb in this abyss of corporate atrocity disguised as a toy factory. The colorful mascots smile eternally, but now we understand those smiles mask. Screaming faces trapped inside. A consciousness imprisoned in forms designed for joy, but filled with agony. That's the true darkness, the perversion of everything toys should represent, the corruption of childhood itself, the demonstration that no symbol is too sacred, no victim too innocent, no line too absolute to be crossed when profit and ambition demand it. Before you go, if you enjoyed this deep dive into the true horror of Poppy Playtime, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. And these longer explorations of gaming lore take significant research and time to create, and your support makes them possible. Let me know in the comments what other dark gaming stories you'd like to see explored, or what theories you have about the remaining mysteries in Poppy Playtime's factory. Until next time, sleep well. And remember, sometimes the most colorful masks hide the darkest secrets.